The stone moved out easily enough as I'd seen before, and it had a hook on the inside of it, by which I could pull it closed behind me. But to get into the narrow dark passage I had to lie on my belly. And when I dropped down on my knees and peered into it, I could see no visible light at the end. I didn't like the look of it. I knew that if I'd been mortal still, nothing could have induced me to crawl into a passage like this, but the old vampire had been plain enough in telling me the sun could destroy me, as surely as the fire. I had to get to the coffin, and I felt the fear coming back in a deluge. I got down flat on the ground and crawled as a lizard might into the passage. As I feared, I could not really raise my head, and there was no room to turn and reach for the hook in the stone. I had to slip my foot into the hook and crawl forward to pull the stone behind me. Total darkness. With room to rise only a few inches on my elbows, I gasped, and the fear welled, and I almost went mad thinking about the fact that I couldn't raise my head. And finally I smacked it against the stone and lay still, whimpering. But what was I to do? I must reach the coffin. So telling myself to stop this whining, I commenced to crawl, faster and faster. My knees scraped the stone, my hands sought crevices and cracks to pull me along. My neck ached with the strain as I struggled not to try to lift my head again in panic. And when my hand suddenly felt solid stone ahead, I pushed upon it with all my strength. I felt it move as a pale light seeped in. I scrambled out of the passage and found myself standing in a small room. The ceiling was low, curved, and the high window was narrow, with the familiar heavy grid of iron bars. But the sweet violet light of the night poured in, revealing a great fireplace cut in the far wall, the wood ready for the torch, and beside it, beneath the window, an ancient stone sarcophagus. My red velvet, fur-lined cape lay over the sarcophagus, and on a rude bench I glimpsed a splendid suit of red velvet worked with gold, and much Italian lace, as well as red silk breeches and white silk hose and red-heeled slippers. I smoothed back my hair from my face and wiped the thin film of sweat from my upper lip and my forehead. It was bloody, this sweat. And when I saw this on my hands, I felt a curious excitement. Ah, what am I thought, and what lies before me? For a long moment I looked at this blood, and then I licked my fingers. A lovely, zinging pleasure passed through me. It was a moment before I could collect myself sufficiently to approach the fireplace. I lifted 2 sticks of kindling as the old vampire had done, and rubbing them very hard and fast, saw them almost disappear as the flame shot up from them. There was no magic in this, only skill. And as the fire warmed me, I took off my soiled clothes, and with my shirt wiped every last trace of human waste away, and threw all this in the fire before putting on the new garments. Iced, dazzling red. Not even Nicholas had had such clothes as these. They were clothes for the court at Versailles, with pearls and tiny rubies worked into their embroidery. The lace of the shirt was Valenciennes, which I had seen on my mother's wedding gown. I put the wolf cape over my shoulders, and though the white chill was gone, from my limbs I felt like a creature carved from ice. My smile felt hard and glittering to me, and strangely slow as I allowed myself to feel and to see these garments. In the blaze of the fire I looked at the coffin. The effigy of an old man was carved upon its heavy lid, and I realized immediately it was the likeness of Magnus. But here he lay in tranquility, his jester's mouth sealed, his eyes staring mildly at the ceiling, his hair a neat mane of deeply carved waves and ringlets. 3 centuries old was this thing surely. He lay with his hands folded on his chest, his garments long robes, and from his sword that had been carved into the stone, someone had broken out the hilt and part of the scabbard. I stared at this for an interminable length of time, seeing that it had been carefully chipped away with much effort. Was it the shape of the cross that someone had sought to remove? I traced it over with my finger. Nothing happened, of course, any more than when I'd murmured all those prayers. And squatting in the dust beside the coffin, I drew a cross there. Again nothing. Then to the cross I added a few strokes to suggest the body of Christ. His arms, the crook of his knees, his bowed head, I wrote, "The Lord Jesus Christ." The only words I could write well, save for my own name, and again nothing. And still glancing back uneasily at the words and the little crucifix, I tried to lift the lid of the coffin. Even with this new strength, it was not easy, and no mortal man alone could have done it. But what perplexed me was the extent of my difficulty. I did not have limitless strength, and certainly I didn't have the strength of the old vampire. Maybe the strength of 3 men was what I now possessed, or the strength of 4 it was impossible to calculate. It seemed pretty damned impressive to me at the moment. I looked into the coffin. Nothing but a narrow place full of shadows where I couldn't imagine myself lying. There were Latin words inscribed around the rim, and I couldn't read them. This tormented me. I wished the words weren't there, and my longing for Magnus, my helplessness, threatened to close in on me. I hated him for leaving me, and it struck me with full ironic force that I'd felt love for him before he'd leapt into the fire. I'd felt love for him when I saw the red garments. Do devils love each other? Do they walk arm in arm in hell saying, "Ah, you are my friend? How I love you," things like that, to each other? It was a rather detached intellectual question I was asking, as I did not believe in hell. But it was a matter of a concept of evil, wasn't it? All creatures in hell are supposed to hate one another, and as all the saved hate the damned without reservation. I'd known that all my life. It had terrified me as a child. The idea that I might go to heaven and my mother might go to hell, and that I should hate her. I couldn't hate her, and what if we were in hell together? Well, now I know, whether I believe in hell or not, that vampires can love each other, that in being dedicated to evil, one does not cease to love, or so it seemed for that brief instant. But don't start crying again. I can't abide all this crying. I turned my eyes to a large wooden chest that was partially hidden at the head of the coffin. It wasn't locked. Its rotted wooden lid fell almost off the hinges when I opened it, and though the old master had said he was leaving me his treasure, I was flabbergasted by what I saw here. The chest was crammed with gems and gold and silver. There were countless jeweled rings, diamond necklaces, ropes of pearls, plate and coins, and hundreds upon hundreds of miscellaneous valuables. I ran my fingers lightly over the heap and then held up handfuls of it, gasping as the light ignited the red of the rubies, the green of the emeralds. I saw refractions of color of which I'd never dreamed, and wealth beyond any calculation. It was the fabled Caribbean pirate's chest, the proverbial king's ransom. And it was mine now. More slowly I examined it. Scattered throughout were personal and perishable articles. Satin masks rotting away from their trimming of gold lace handkerchiefs, and bits of cloth to which were fixed pins and brooches. Here was a strip of leather, harness hung with gold bells. A moldering bit of lace slipped through a ring. Snuff boxes by the dozens, lockets of velvet ribbon. Had Magnus taken all this from his victims? I lifted up a jewel-encrusted sword, far too heavy for these times, and a worn slipper saved, perhaps for its rhinestone buckle. Of course he had taken what he wanted. Yet he himself had worn rags, the tattered costume of another age, and he lived here as a hermit might have lived in some earlier century. I couldn't understand it, but there were other objects scattered about in his treasure. Rosaries made up of gorgeous gems, and they still had their crucifixes. I touched the small sacred images. I shook my head and bit my lip, as if to say how awful that he should have stolen these, but I also found it very funny, and further proof that God had no power over me. And as I was thinking about this, trying to decide if it was as fortuitous as it seemed for the moment, I lifted from the treasure an exquisite pearl-handled mirror. I looked into it almost unconsciously, as one often glances in mirrors. And there I saw myself as a man might expect, except that my skin was very white, as the old fiend's had been white, and my eyes had been transformed from their usual blue to a mingling of violet and cobalt that was softly iridescent. My hair had a high luminous sheen, and when I ran my fingers back through it, I felt a new and strange vitality there. In fact, this was not Lestat in the mirror at all, but some replica of him made of other substances, and the few lines time had given me by the age of 20 years were gone, or greatly simplified and just a little deeper than they had been. I stared at my reflection. I became frantic to discover myself in it. I rubbed my face, even rubbed the mirror, and pressed my lips together to keep from crying. Finally, I closed my eyes and opened them again, and I smiled very gently at the creature. He smiled back. That was Lestat, all right. And there seemed nothing in his face that was, anyway, malevolent. Well, not very malevolent, just the old mischief, the impulsiveness. He could have been an angel, in fact, this creature, except that when his tears did rise they were red, and the entire image was tinted red because his vision was red. And he had these evil little teeth that he could press into his lower lip when he smiled that made him look absolutely terrifying. A good enough face with one thing horribly, horribly wrong with it. But it suddenly occurred to me I'm looking at my own reflection. And hadn't it been said enough that ghosts and spirits and those who have lost their souls to hell have no reflections in mirrors? A lust to know all things about what I was came over me. A lust to know how I should walk among mortal men. I wanted to walk in the streets of Paris, seeing with my new eyes all the miracles of life that I had ever glimpsed. I wanted to see the faces of the people, to see the flowers in bloom, and the butterflies, to see Nicky, to hear Nicky play his music. No, forswear that. But there were 1,000 forms of music, weren't there? And as I closed my eyes, I could almost hear the orchestra of the opera, the arias rising in my ears. So sharp the recollection, so clear. But nothing would be ordinary now, not joy or pain or the simplest memory. All would possess this magnificent luster, even grief for things that were forever lost. I put down the mirror, and taking one of the old yellowed lace handkerchiefs from the chest, I wiped my tears. I turned and sat down slowly before the fire. Delicious, the warmth on my face and hands. A great sweet drowsiness came over me, and as I closed my eyes again, I felt myself immersed, suddenly, in the strange dream of Magnus stealing the blood. A sense of enchantment returned, of dizzying pleasure. Magnus holding me, connected to me, my blood flowing into him. But I heard the chain scraping the floor of the old catacomb. I saw the defenseless vampire thing in Magnus's arms. Something more to it, something important, a meaning. About theft, treachery, about surrendering to no one, not God, not demon, and never man. I thought and thought about it, half awake, half dreaming again. And the maddest thought came to me that I would tell Nicky all about this. That as soon as I got home I would lay it all out, the dream, the possible meaning, and we would talk. With an ugly shock I opened my eyes. The human in me looked helplessly about this chamber. He started to weep again, and the newborn fiend was too young yet to rein him in. The sobs came up like hiccups, and I put my hand over my mouth. Magnus, why did you leave me? Magnus, what am I supposed to do? How do I go on? I drew up my knees and rested my head on them. And slowly my head began to clear. Well, it has been great fun pretending you will be this vampire creature, I thought, wearing these splendid clothes, running your fingers through all that glorious lucre. You can't live as this, you can't feed on living things, even if you are a monster. You have a conscience in you, natural to you. Good and evil, good and evil. You cannot live without believing in. You cannot abide the acts that tomorrow you will what? You will drink blood, won't you? The gold and the precious stones glowed like embers in the nearby chest, and beyond the bars of the window, there rose against the gray clouds the violet shimmer of the distant city. What is their blood like? Hot living blood, not monster blood? My tongue pushed at the roof of my mouth at my fangs. Think on it, wolf killer. I rose to my feet slowly. It was as if the will made it happen rather than the body, so easy was it. And I picked up the iron keyring which I'd brought with me from the outer chamber, and I went to inspect the rest of my tower.